Hello and welcome to this Arts Business session, part of Hamilton Arts Council's Professional Development Series 2021. Hamilton Arts Council serves arts communities within the Greater Hamilton area, including Ancaster, Dundas, Flamborough, Glanbrook, Hamilton, Stony Creek, Waterdown, and Six Nations of the Grand River. We acknowledge that this area is situated upon the traditional territories of the Erie, Neutral, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas. This land is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which is an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabeg to share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. We further acknowledge that this land is covered by the Between the Lakes Purchase, 1792, between the Crown and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and we further acknowledge that acknowledgement is not enough. We envision a dynamic arts community that is innovative, impactful, diverse, and professionally sustainable. We hope you have had an opportunity to explore all of the upcoming professional development sessions taking place between October and December in 2021. You can find these via our website, www.hamiltonartscouncil.ca. Click Programs and then Professional Development. At this point, I'd like to welcome our presenter, Craig Lowe, who's going to take us through today's session. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Craig, to introduce yourself and kick us off. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, David. Thanks for having me. Welcome, everybody, to my guide to project planning. So just a little bit about myself. Hold on a second here. What's going on? There we go. So this is my bio. Normally I don't talk about myself in the third person, but this is just the short version of who I am. I'm mostly in the event management field, but I've also been a nonprofit manager. I ran a children's charity for 5 years. Right now, because the pandemic has pretty much curtailed all event management activities, I focus largely on doing graphic and web design, mostly for the not-for-profit sector. So I do have some clients in that. I've been doing all of this for about 24 years. I've worked on some very large things. I was involved in the Rowe Winter Fair. I've produced some events here in Hamilton, including some events for the Hamilton Arts Council a couple of years ago. I was programmer at Burlington Public Library for 2 years, and now I'm kind of working on my own project, which is on hold until things get settled. And what else can I say about myself? I mean, I've graduated from Durham College. I actually studied sports management, but I decided not to pursue that. But I mean, from that, I was able to get an internship at Maple Leaf Gardens, and then that turned into the Rowe Winter Fair. So it transitioned into event management. And I've also been certified a few years ago in festivals and events management from the University of Minnesota, which is an amazing online program if you're so inclined to take something like that. All right, so project planning, what is it? Well, it is the roadmap to your destination. It determines what you want to do and how you're going to get there. It's essentially the nuts and bolts of your project. It's more the technical side of things, although programming and creative stuff are in there. And it's also about the management of your resources. You've got your money and materials, you've got your time, and of course, your people. So project planning is sort of the overall and project management is the overall aspect. It's the master plan, if you will, and then it's made up of several sub-plans. You've got your project development and your goal setting, so what you want to achieve and how and when. Resource acquisition, allocation, and management, which is just a verbose way of saying what you need to complete the project. Scheduling, communications, both internally and externally. Risk management and assessment and management, which is the scary but very important part. And then evaluation, how will you know if you're successful? So I'm going to touch on all of these things today. The purpose of the presentation really though, because it's only an hour, we're going to just do a very broad introductory overview. It's kind of the Cole's Notes version. Each one of these elements could be its own course, and in many cases it is. But what I wanted to do today is to give you a basic understanding of what goes into project planning, give you some pro tips, and hopefully use this as the starting point for further learning. So what is a project? A project is defined as any undertaking that sets out to achieve a particular goal or objective that has a definitive start and end. So it's not anything that's ongoing. So an example would be a festival or an event or show, a tour, a program. So if you have like a summer camp or a course, it could be a fundraising initiative that has a definitive start or end date, the creation or renovation of a venue or space. And I also would say if you're starting an organization, that's a project until you actually get it launched, because there's a lot of these elements go into that. But you know, day-to-day operations are not generally considered projects. So these are the kinds of projects that I feel anybody who would be attending today would be interested in. I mean, there's tons of other projects out there, but I figured these would be the ones that we will talk about mostly. So let's start with project development. So before beginning any project, you really want to establish what the project will be and to set your goals and objectives. So simply, what are you trying to achieve and why, and how will you know if you've actually done that? And that's the first thing you need to do before you really do anything else, because it's the foundation upon which everything else takes place. So you want to start by defining your project. What is it? And this is probably where the programming element would come in. What is it? Who's it for? When and where will it happen? And then the how is everything else that happens after that, the rest of the plan. What problem are you solving? What is the need for the project? That's a very important one, especially if you're looking for funding. You want to be solving some kind of a problem. A project just for the sake of a project is generally not going to get a lot of support. So you want to say, this is something that needs to take place because, and then go from there. And like I said, especially if you're seeking funding bodies, granting bodies, sponsors, anything like that, they're going to want to see that you are actually solving a problem or demonstrating a clear need. So for example, you could say, I want to start a music festival, which is great. There are lots of music festivals in Hamilton. So how will your music festival be different from Supercrawl and the Sound of Music Festival in Burlington, things like that? Like what is going to differentiate you? Because that's what's going to get people interested in and excited in it. What will the project look like upon completion? So what's the grand vision? And of course, the clearer the vision, the better the chance for success. So you want to start with your idea and then flesh it out into something more concrete and well-defined. And some projects are going to be more easily and instantly defined than others. Again, using the music festival example, you may need to explain more thoroughly why you want to do a music festival. Whereas if your project is, we need to renovate our kitchen, that's a little more easily defined, because nobody's going to say, well, somebody else already renovated their kitchen, so why are you renovating your kitchen? Obviously, you don't live in their kitchen, so you can explain that more easily to people. And this is why it's very important that you want to do your homework and your research. You want to sort of really look into why this is important. And some projects never get off the ground because through the research stage, you realize this isn't really going to work. So here are some tips in terms of project development. So try to have some clearly defined parameters that can be quantified. Do as much relevant research as possible before you get started. Be realistic and work within your means. You don't want to take on more than you can handle. It's much wiser to start modestly and grow. You want to start the planning process as far in advance as possible. Give yourself lots of lead time, because you may find that certain funding sources require a long lead time. Certain artists may need to be booked well in advance. So you don't want to come up with an idea for an event or like a gallery or something like that, and then all of a sudden you want to do it like next week. That's not generally very realistic. Be flexible and be prepared to make changes as necessary. That often happens. And as I mentioned, the most successful projects are the ones that can clearly demonstrate a need. So resource acquisition and management, what is that? It is all the money, materials, and people you need to complete the project. So the first thing you want to do is you want to make a list of every single thing you can think of that you would need to spend money on. Even if you're not going to spend money on it, you still want to assume you're going to spend money on it. So all the spaces you need, all the equipment, whether it's a construction project, whether it's a fundraiser, whether it's an event, you want to list everything that you're going to need, and you want to do that first, because then you're going to, what's happening? There we go. Oh, you're going to want to make a list of every person you need to complete your project. So the reason why you do the things first is because, let's say you're doing something that requires tents. You're going to realize, oh, I need people to put up tents, but you're not going to know that you need people to put up tents until you know that you need tents. Or if you're, again, if it's a renovation project, we're going to refinish wood, so we might need carpenters. You're not going to know that until you have established that that's something you're going to be doing. And like I said, the number of people will influence will be influenced by the amount of equipment and materials that you need. So the next thing you're going to do is you're going to lay out a rough schedule. How many days, roughly, how many hours. You don't need to get into too much detail, but essentially what you're doing here is you're figuring out, is the project going to last 2 weeks? Is the project going to last 2 months? Because that's going to influence how many people you need, how much you might have to pay them if you're paying them, or how many volunteers you might need, how long you're going to need to rent things, anything that's time sensitive. Okay. And then from all of this information, you're going to put together a budget. And you want to start with the expenses first. That way you get the full cost of your project wish list. I call it a wish list because it's not very often that where you start is where you finish, but you want to sort of say, okay, this is what I really want it to look like. And then you're going to cost all that out, and then you're going to suddenly realize, oh wow, that's a lot, and maybe you need to scale back. Or maybe you're fortunate enough to have all the money you need and then you don't have to worry about it, but at least you've got the expenses figured out first. The other thing you want to do is, even if you can get things for free, a lot of times you can get equipment donated, you can get people to volunteer their time, but you want to figure out the cost as if you were paying full price for it. And the reason for that is this tells you what the actual value of the event is. And if you're working out a sponsorship, or if you're getting funding, you can then say, well, this loaned or donated piece of equipment is worth $1,000, so that's $1,000 sponsorship that you may want to recognize down the road. And then once you've figured all of the expenses out, then you got to figure out how to pay for it. And again, in some cases, somebody may say, here's $25,000, go do a project, in which case then you're basically trying to figure out how to stay within $25,000. But if that's not the case, then you want to figure out how much money you need to pay for all of this stuff, where you're getting the money from. You may seek volunteers to help reduce the cost of labor. You may get donations, or you may get loans of equipment, but you will know what to ask for and how much to ask for if you work out all your needs in the beginning. And then you want to figure out all the different sources of revenue that exist. And I know as artists, we're frequently told grants, 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 which is true, but there are lots of ways to raise money for a project. Here are some examples on the screen. You've got earned revenue, which would be, say, things like ticket sales, sponsorships and advertising, donations. There are others as well, but I mean, I doubt anybody's going to be selling streaming rights or anything like that, but there are lots of ways, and you want to figure those out and then kind of work out how much you think you can generate from each one. And then once you've done all that, you may realize, oh, this doesn't line up. What do I do here? So you may need to, I mean, ideally you would sort of reduce your expenses, or again, if you're fortunate enough, maybe you can find more money. But usually your first go at a budget is not going to be perfect. So you're gonna need some time to sort of even everything out. And like I said, you may end up looking for sponsors or donors or grants. This is all a separate workshop or separate workshops. And I would encourage you to check those out if you can. So in terms of this aspect of project planning, so my pro tips would be, you want to be flexible, but not too flexible because you don't want to overextend yourself. You do want to build in protection against unforeseen circumstances, though. Things happen. I can't tell you how many times, you run into a problem. I mean, even my wife and I are renovating our house right now, and we've run into all kinds of problems that we didn't anticipate. So it's always good to build in some protection if you can. I realize it's not always possible, but if you can, you want to. Budgeting is a skill that comes with practice, and perfecting it comes with experience. I mean, the more if a project is recurring, the more you do it, the easier it's going to be to budget for it, and the more accurate your budgets are going to be right off the bat. You want to spread your revenue sources around as much as possible, again, if you can. And the reason why you want to do that is if something doesn't pan out, then you've got other things to cover that. So if your ticket sales fall short, you've got other ways of covering it. If you're and that way you're not relying too heavily on ticket sales, for example. You're not relying too heavily on sponsorships. You're not relying too heavily on grants. So ideally, you want your budget to have multiple sources, again, if that's relevant. And then, do your research. Find out what others are done. Almost anything there is to do has been done by somebody at some point in time. So if you can find out what they did and get that information, that will always be an amazing way to sort of start off your project. I also recommend working out the financial value of your volunteers. People are valuable, very valuable. And when you see how much money they're saving you, you will have a much greater appreciation of them, because if you had to pay all these people, you're talking in the thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars, depending on the size of your project. I also strongly recommend treat your volunteers well. Treat anybody who's given you money well as well. And anybody, and that could be, if it's people buying tickets, if it's people who've donated money, because if they see that you appreciate and respect their time and their money, and you've demonstrated that, then they're going to want to volunteer for you again or give you money again. Don't start your project until you know where all your money is coming from. Can't stress that one enough. If you haven't figured everything out, don't start. Don't figure it out later, because that might end up being a problem. And have a plan in place in case your project loses money. It does happen. It happens a lot. And so you need to have a game plan. I'm going to talk about that more under the risk management side of things. Scheduling. Scheduling is just another way you manage your resources, really. They show you, it's really how you know what's happening when. And it works hand in hand with a budget. Budgets and schedules actually go together very nicely. They're like two sides of a coin, because one tells you the how much, but the other one will tell you how and or what, when, and where. So that way you know like when you're allocating money. And depending on the size and scope of your project, you could end up having 3 different types of schedules. There's pre-production, production, and post-production schedules. So the pre-production schedule would involve the planning and resource gathering aspects of the project. It's typically set out in increments of weeks or months, sometimes days, and it will generally include your timelines for things like booking your personnel, your venues, your equipment, any revenue generating aspects of the project, so funding proposals. Permits, always good to have permits. Your marketing. So all those things are sort of set out in your pre-production schedule, and then your production schedule would cover the period when your project is in production. So that would be, for example, if it's an event, then it would cover your setup, execution, and teardown. If you're doing a fundraiser, it would be the period where you're actively raising money. If it's a renovation or construction production schedule, that would cover everything from when you start demolishing to completion of the construction work. If it's a tour production schedule, then it would cover from the time everybody gathers and all the equipment is gathered together at the airport or the train station or wherever you're going and however you're getting there, and all the way through until you've come back. So production schedules are typically set out in days and hours, and they're usually very detailed, far more detailed than a pre-production schedule, because you're getting into things like a running order. More things are happening more frequently, so you want to be as detailed as possible. And if your project has an event, if your project has an event, you might end up having 2 versions of your production schedule. So one would be your sort of public schedule, which would appear on your website or in your program, and that's for the public. And then you might have a production schedule for the people who are working on the event, and that has like way more detail that the public doesn't necessarily need. And in some cases, if you've got a really big project, you might have multiple schedules covering different areas. So if it's, again, using the event example, if you have multiple stages, stage 1 might have its own schedule and stage 2 might have its own schedule. And then you have a master schedule that would cover everything. Then you get your post-production schedule. And a post-production schedule would cover everything once the project is done and cleaned up. And again, you go back to sort of like the day, week, month format, and it will cover your things like paying out your expenses, any funding reports you have to complete, thanking your participants and supporters, returning rented or borrowed items, and internal evaluation and reporting. And if your project is recurring, you might end up having multiple schedules for the same project. Like if it's a monthly event, or monthly event's probably a good one. And then that way you might have a startup, like pre-production, production, and post-production for each one of those months. Again, depending on what kind of event it is. So my pro tips for scheduling, make your schedule as detailed as possible. The more information you can convey, the better. It's always good to give people more than what they want, or more than they need, because it's usually what they want. Stick to the schedule. Nobody likes waiting around for something to happen or have something run longer than planned. Build in what we call slack, which is basically extra time into production schedules, just in case something takes longer to complete or to account for setting up. I've worked on some music events where the person who did the scheduling didn't account for the fact that you've got to have turnover between acts, and so they had like act, and then you ended up behind schedule because, of course, you had to change over in between performers. So you want to make sure you do stuff like that. And again, just like budgeting, scheduling is a skill that comes with experience and practice. And then finally, somebody else has probably done something similar to what you're doing at some point in time. If you can get an example of it, that's always a good idea to use as a template. There's no sense in reinventing the wheel. Communications. Have a solid communication plan. Can't stress this enough. Have a solid communication plan. It is very, very important. Many great project ideas have been undermined by poor communication. I've got tons of examples of this. So you've got, first you got internal communication, and that would be communicating with the project's organizers, your contractors, your staff, your volunteers, anybody who is involved in actually putting on the project. It can involve things like meetings. You could have reports, memos, contracts, your schedules, budgets, of course, and anything. It could be electronic or on paper. You want everything to be conveyed clearly and with detail. You want the people who can answer your questions to be available and provide that information. There's nothing more frustrating than, what do we do now? And the person who has that answer is nowhere to be found. Put as much information in writing as possible to avoid confusion. You said this. No, I said this. If it's in writing, you don't have that. Lack of communication always will lead to some problem. Always. External communication. So this is any conveying of information to people outside your project. It could be your sponsors, your donors, the media, the government, the public, your audience. And you'll notice I said the public and your audience, and they distinguish between the two because your audience are the people who've committed to being involved in your project. The public are the people who have not. Those are the people you may need to convince to get interested in your project. So I always consider those to be two different things. It can include any communication that goes outside your organization or your immediate team, right? It can be all your proposals, it can be your applications, your media releases, any marketing campaigns you're doing, right? Your website is very important, social media, any publicity, right? Anything that conveys information to people who are not involved in working on the project directly. So you can use this. I mean, obviously, you're raising money if you're obtaining a permit, sourcing materials and equipment. I want to go back to the permit for a second. Again, permit applications. Anybody who's dealt with the city, the better and clearer your application is, the more information, the faster your application will get processed. So this is where your communication skills need to come into play. If you leave out things, if you forget things, if you're not clear, it will just delay things. and for sometimes a very long time. Attracting volunteers. If you want to get media attention, if you're selling tickets. And again, the same principle applies, whether it's internal or external. I mean, you want to tell people what they need to know in a clear and timely manner, but also you need to understand what they need to know. So some of my tips here for this, I mean, you want to eliminate guesswork. Unless your project involves like a trivia contest or something, you want to eliminate guesswork. You want people to have to figure things out. You want to just say, this is what's happening. Here's all the information you need. It's often better to provide too much information than not enough, although you also have to make sure you're not providing information that you shouldn't be providing. So it's, you know, finding that balance between making sure they have more than they need, but not too much. Schedules and budgets are definitely part of effective communication. Again, if somebody can look at your schedule or your budget and know exactly what's going on, you've done a great job. Effectively communicated information won't guarantee you the results you want, but it will guarantee you better results than poor communication. I think that's fairly self-explanatory. I mean, you're not always going to get exactly what you want, but if you don't communicate it well, you definitely won't get exactly what you want. And know your audience. Use the right communication tool for whoever you're talking to. Some people like to talk by text. Some people, you know, use Facebook. Some people still read the Spectator in print. So you have to know who you're trying to attract and then use that. Now we come to risk management, risk assessment and management. This is the scary but very important part. There we go. So there are two types of risk in project planning, and really in life, but in project planning, there are two types of risk: physical risk and financial risk. The two are often connected, but require different kinds of planning. So first, you've got physical risk. That is anything where the potential for damage to property, injury, or death exists. And the pandemic has definitely put a spotlight on this. Nobody wants to be a super spreader, whatever the project is. So there's definitely been more of a focus on risk management because of that. Physical risk can be mitigated in many ways. One, follow the safety instructions on equipment. Very, very clear. Looking out for safety hazards. In a venue setup, there's, you know, trip hazards. Are there cables on the floor that need to be taped down? Things that could fall. Is there a fire hazard? Are doors and aisles being blocked? Is there broken equipment? And all of those things can happen. Preparing for weather, especially if your event is outside or your project is outside. You could be building something outside. You want to prepare for weather. If your event involves alcohol, obey the liquor laws, please. It's easy to say, oh, does it matter? Yeah, it does. I have seen examples of charities that have had to shut down because they were sued by somebody's family who was killed by a drunk driver. There's a famous case or infamous case involving, I think it was the United Way up in Barrie or something like that. They had a fundraiser, overserved, somebody got in their car and killed someone. They got sued. Now they don't exist. So obey the liquor laws. And further that, hire qualified people to perform tasks where risk is involved. If you don't know how to drive a forklift, don't drive a forklift. Get smart serve people to serve your alcohol. If you are not familiar with fireworks, don't shoot off fireworks. Get somebody who knows what they're doing. Get qualified security. There's countless examples of people being roughed up by volunteer security who didn't know what they were doing or were properly trained, I guess is a better way to put it. First aid personnel, like where you can do it. Know the safety rules and the regulations around whatever project you're doing, especially the fire code. You don't need to know every word, but you should be aware that if you're working with like flammable chemicals or something like that, I think all chemicals are flammable, but where are the risks and where are the dangers? And again, if you can afford it, hire somebody who can advise you on this stuff. People love to sue when they get hurt, and you don't want to have that happen, which leads to financial risk. Anything that could lead to financial losses. So financial risks are not always caused by physical risks, but physical risks always lead to financial risks. So, if something gets stolen, you may have to replace the property. If somebody gets hurt, again, people love to sue. Personal injury lawyers are everywhere. You don't want to give them business. But further to that, it can be things like careless handling of money, theft of property, not paying your bills on time or fulfilling your contracts, not having a plan to address a deficit, and not addressing physical risks that could lead to exposure to lawsuits. I have seen numerous examples of the first four. I have seen money go missing. I have seen things get stolen. I have worked with people who don't pay their bills on time. I have had clients who did not pay their bills on time, including me. You don't want to do that. You don't want to be that. You don't want to be that person. And like I said, if you think there's a risk of the project losing money, have a plan. Whether it's a bank loan or your own money, whatever it is, you don't want to be caught owing money to people. It's not a good look, and you will get a reputation. Financial risk can be mitigated in many ways. Again, have some policies and procedures around handling of money. Whenever I do an event that involves cash, I make sure that I count the money in front of other people. I'm not alone, and I get somebody else to count it with me. That way, there's no chance of somebody saying you did not, where's the money? Have sufficient security, whether that's people, whether that's a padlock, whatever it is, security cameras, make sure that there's sufficient security. Have a plan to cover your deficits. Again, I've seen this before, and it can be very problematic. Buy insurance. I know insurance is expensive. It's less expensive than defending a lawsuit. And again, many places will not even let you in the door if you don't have insurance. Risk management is all about anticipating situations and addressing them before they happen. And sometimes unusual occurrences will happen that you didn't anticipate. I had to deal with a lice outbreak once. I've had a food vendor who didn't show up on the day of an event. I've had the aforementioned money go missing and stuff like that. So, things will happen, but it's how you deal with it that is going to minimize your risk. If you make a very strong effort to address the problem, you can usually salvage the situation. Make sure you have insurance that covers your project well. Do a walkthrough of your project space to make sure you've seen all the hazards, because there usually are some. Only have qualified people perform the tasks where risk could be present. Never ignore hazards. Never. Fix them. And always respond to complaints in a timely manner. If you let something go, that's just another opportunity for somebody else to get hurt. And have financial policies and procedures in place to reduce the risk of loss. This is, if you have an organization, that'll often be in your bylaws. But again, I've seen many situations where money has disappeared, and you don't want to be caught in the middle of that. Follow all the safety rules and procedures. And I know this sounds like you're being a stick in the mud, but follow the laws. If you're the person who's in charge of a project, you've got to make sure that that's all happening, because it's going to all come down to you. Last but not least, evaluation. So your project is done, and it's been a huge success, hopefully. It has been a huge success. Once your project is complete, it's important to evaluate everything that took place. You want to have meetings with key stakeholders and participants, and you want to also put together some detailed reports. So your post-project evaluation should include your financial statements, any stakeholder feedback, and that's anybody and everybody. If it is an event and you want to survey your audience, you want to talk to people who participated, whether it's performers, volunteers, everybody, get their feedback. Hopefully nothing happens, but if something does, you've got an incident report, and just anything that's relevant that will help you evaluate whether or not the project was successful. And you should be able to answer, what happened, what went well, what could be improved. I prefer to say that over what went wrong, because I feel anything that's gone wrong, there's a solution for it. So what could be improved? What would you do differently if you were to do the project again? And finally, did you meet your goals? Did you do what you're supposed to do? And again, you want your evaluation to be as detailed as possible, especially if you're going to do another one of these projects, and especially if other people are going to be planning the next one. If you are not going to do the next one, I've worked on things where I didn't do the last one, and then you have to turn into a detective to figure out what happened at the last one, so that you make sure that you either, you do the things well that happened well, and you don't do the things that did not happen well. But you can't know that unless you have some sort of report that details all of that. And again, a lot of funding bodies will make this a requirement anyway. So if you've gotten government grants or if you've gotten a sponsorship, they're going to want to see this information no matter what. My pro tips around evaluation: begin the evaluation process as soon after the completion of the project as possible. Don't wait 3 months. Do it right away, because you want everything while it's still fresh. Gather the information and feedback from as many stakeholders as possible, because you want a nice, strong diversity of perspectives. Right? It doesn't matter what you thought; it's what did everybody else think too. Be as detailed as possible. And use your effective communication skills to present this information and to promote how successful your project was, because it was. Finally, so I've got some final tips for everyone. So as I said at the beginning, this is a brief overview. This is the Coles Notes version. But hopefully you've gotten enough information here, and this information, I hopefully haven't bombarded you with too much. But I mean, these are all the things that go into project planning, and everything I've mentioned here can be a separate learning experience, and there are lots of great places to learn this information. But project planning and management is about 3 things. It's about taking a well-developed idea, making sure it happens on time, on budget, and with as few problems as possible. You're never going to have no problems, but as few as possible. It's all about the details. Details, details, details. If you're not detail-oriented, probably shouldn't be doing this. It's both process-focused and results-driven. Normally in my day-to-day life, I'm not really a process-focused person, but when it comes to this, I am. Because if you don't follow process, sometimes you won't get results. Project planners need to be people managers. They need to be numbers managers. They need to be problem solvers, definitely problem solvers. And you need to be really, really well organized. If you're not a well-organized person, you're probably not going to succeed in this area. You'll often wear as many hats as you may wear many hats, sometimes at once. That's very true. And while project planning skills can be applied across a number of different projects, you should be well versed in the type of project that you are planning. I would never plan a golf tournament because I don't golf. I have no experience planning transit projects, so I would not do that. And even like if you're like, when you look at event planners, which is definitely a type of project planning, you'll have people who specialize in festivals. Some people specialize in weddings or birthday parties or conference planning. So you should really know, you should be well versed in what you're doing. That's really what I'm saying. You need to be rigid yet flexible. I mean, you want to have your plan, you want to stick to your plan, but things are going to come up and you need to be able to change when they need to be changed. Be prepared for the unexpected. Always happens. I have lots of horror stories, and some of them are actually quite funny in hindsight, but at the time they were not funny. So here's some great resources you can check out. Charity Village is amazing. They have lots of great courses, especially if you're in the not-for-profit sector. Lots of great courses. Festival and Events Ontario. They have an amazing risk management program that's happening right now. It's very, very detailed. It's very scary, but it's very necessary. There are lots of books out there you can get from Indigo and Amazon. There's lots of courses out there. Unfortunately, nothing I'm mentioning here is free, but if you're serious about this, definitely worth the investment. And that's me. That's my time.
Well planned out and executed within the 40 minutes that we had discussed. So I'm so grateful for that, Craig. Thank you so much. There was so much in that as you were describing it just made logical sense, but perhaps I hadn't thought about it in a certain way. So I really appreciated that. I want to just remind everyone that Craig's slides will be made available to you, and you will be able to follow those through. So if there's anything that you're desperately trying to remember, the session is recorded as well as the slides will be available. invite you to put any direct or specific questions in the chat, and we can put those to Craig now. Craig, do you want to sort of finish screen sharing?
Yes. How do I do that?
I think there will
Pause
be
share.
oh,
Stop share. There we go.
Perfect. There we are.
Yes.
Good to see you. So, and I thought
David?
just yes, Sheila.
We have a comment in the chat. Thanks for the great presentation and info. Keep up the great work, keeping the music alive. Enjoy.
Oh, thank you.
Marvelous. We also had a comment from Gerald, who's on the call, who when we were talking about the alcohol permits, and he said that he did get a permit once and it was only $25, which has also been my experience actually, that the permit getting can seem rather overwhelming, but it's actually quite easy to do and not too expensive for that sort of coverage.
And it protects you.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. One question that we've got that's come in, Craig, that says, is there any software that you recommend or software that you use for tracking your projects?
Once upon a time I used Microsoft Project, but I don't think that exists anymore. Honestly, Excel spreadsheets. Lots and lots, or I mean, if you want to share them, I mean, Google Sheets are a good one. They have their own version of Excel. That's actually a really good one because you can do a lot with that. I mean, you can do your budgets in Excel, you can do your schedules in Excel. It's very versatile. So yeah, that would be the one I would recommend.
Excellent. I was wondering,
David, we also, sorry to keep interrupting you.
Not at all.
We also have a second comment from David Cartier, saying helpful to join Musicians Guild for insurance. So that might be applicable to other organizations as well.
Fantastic. I was wondering, Craig, where in the project planning sort of timeline that you had laid out, where you might focus looking at accessibility and where I guess it's something that we try to concentrate on now, particularly as we're going back into looking at venues for events and projects, looking at things like the types of bathrooms or physical accessibility to a space. I wonder if you have any comments or experience with that.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I mean, there's two places where you would look at that. I mean, project development, because that's where you're choosing your space. Mm-hmm. And obviously risk management as well, because you want to make sure as you're doing your walkthrough of a space that, because you can have a space with, wheelchair ramps and elevators and things like that. But if you've blocked pathways, you really haven't, you've kind of negated having all of those other accessibility features. So, I mean, when you're designing, like, again, using an event, when you're designing your event space, you want to make sure that it's great that you've gotten people in the building, but now you want to get people around the building at the same time. So definitely when you're planning, but then again, when you're doing sort of like your risk management part of it, to make sure that everything is still accessible. And I know one of the tricky ones right now, and this was talked about a lot recently with outdoor events, when you're doing an event in a park, that can present challenges because mobility devices don't necessarily travel well over grass. So these are the sorts of things you have to be thinking about and looking at. And if you aren't well versed in mobility issues, there's plenty of people out there who have mobility issues who will be happy to share their experiences with you. And so you should definitely try to talk to them, maybe even have somebody involved in the planning if it's relevant. And that way you get that firsthand experience, because you may not think of these things. Mm-hmm.
Great. And sort of last question from me, really, I guess, particularly when we're looking at larger scale projects, events or festivals, when it comes to potentially hiring someone like yourself, an event organizer, or how do we go about that?
How do you go about hiring me specifically, or just
Well,
anybody?
it could be, it's an opportunity, could be used. I've worked with you before. You're very good at
Yeah.
what you do. So
You know
I
how
can
to find
certainly-
me.
I can certainly advocate for that. But I mean,
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, there's, I mean, people will advertise themselves. Again, if you are in the festival world, Festivals and Events Ontario has a very thorough membership directory. Now, granted, not everybody's in there, but there are a lot of people who are. But I mean, a simple Google search, and sometimes, I mean, you know, just ask around. Who did you work with? I mean, David's worked with me. If you need to hire me, he knows how to find me, and he's clearly an advocate for me. So I mean, it's also, again, like who you know, really. And you know, if you've been to an event that was particularly well done, somewhere out there they will mention who was involved behind putting it together. You know, it might be on their website, or if there's a program. And so just, you know, keep those names handy and try to find them.
Marvelous. Thank you very
But
much.
I don't think there's not really a central directory. I mean, if that's what you're asking, there's nothing like that, but
Okay.
there's places.
Jessica or Sheila, do we have any other specific questions come up?
Yes, Marianne says it would be part of communications too. And I apologize, Marianne, for not capturing that comment when it was made specifically.